Hi everyone, this is chapter 1, Introduction to Communication Research. In this chapter, we'll be looking at things that we have been doing even before we have taken a research methods course, how the things that we do, the way we find information are essentially very similar to what researchers do. But in this chapter, we'll see how it's different for researchers or scientists who actually do the experiments or conduct research to find information. So that's the heart of today's chapter. So what is research? Research is the process of asking questions and finding answers. With that, all of us are in some ways researchers. When you're looking for a school to attend or college to attend, how do you make that decision? Did you ask your friends maybe? Or perhaps you asked family members who live in Houston or in a city that you live in about universities in the area? And perhaps you went online to do some research to find out courses that might be interesting to you or that you have interest in. Maybe you're interested in how many credits you can transfer from the schools that you come from. Maybe you're interested in how much the tuition will cost. Maybe you're interested in how long the program is going to be. So there are a number of questions that were on your mind before you choose a college. So all of us, we will have taken a process that's similar or different than the one I've just said, probably very similar. Questions that we're interested to find answers for are probably more or less the ones that I've mentioned. Perhaps there are other considerations, but we see that all of us take some research steps to find the information that we need in order for us to make a decision on what to do. So eventually you end up at this institution. So all of us would have taken a different kind of process or steps, more or less similar, but they're different. Okay, so what makes it different for researchers, especially as we study communication research? What is it different for researchers? We take the same approach. We have something that we're interested to know. We find information and we try to answer that question that we have. The difference is, though, is that researchers or communication researchers, we take a scientific and systematic process or procedure that we take. So all communication researchers or just researchers in general, when we seek information or find data that is to answer our questions, we take some systematic steps that are pretty much the same. It's consistent across disciplines usually, and every researcher who is using the same approach will more or less be able to go through the same steps. And if the variables and as well as the conditions that they are working in are very, very similar, the outcome or the findings are more or less going to be very similar as well. So the difference between a researcher or a social scientist, especially with the focus of our course, is that the communication researcher takes predetermined steps, very rigorous, systematic process of identifying a research problem, framing it as a hypothesis or research question, and then taking a very systematic approach to find information to answer the questions. Research is also empirical. I will combine the bottom two points here. Communication research is empirical because we believe that the truth is out there. We believe that if we find the data to answer the question, we are able to find the data and be able to respond or answer the question that we have. So if we believe that the truth is out there, that data out there is going to help us answer questions that we have, then there is this assumption that this data or the pattern that we're curious about, that we're interested to study, is somewhere out there and it can be uncovered. Meaning to say, it can be found, it could be understood. It's something that we have to go out and see, to observe, to capture. What is your relationship with research? So we're talking about us. students of communication research, what is our relationship with research? So first of all, in terms of scholarly research, we play the role of researcher because we have question or problem that we're curious to find answers for. We go seek those information out. So we are taking a first-hand approach towards finding that information. What we are also research consumers. Now, as you read this textbook in this course, as you take the other courses in this program, your professors would introduce you to findings from other scholars, the findings that the other scholars found in their research activity or the experiments or the investigations that they undertook. So the findings that they found, and they analyze it and they share it to us, the broader community, then we are the research consumer because we are absorbing, we're receiving the data, or rather the findings, the analysis that those researchers are presenting and sharing with us. So there's scholarly research where the researcher is curious about a question, seeks information for that. So that's the role of researcher. We are also at the same time research consumers because we digest, we take advantage of the findings from other scholars, and we consume it. We benefit from it because we learn what other researchers have learned in their journey. Research can also look like a proprietary research. Now, the difference between proprietary research as compared to scholarly research is that proprietary research are commissioned for private use. So oftentimes these will be private companies, can be enterprises, businesses that are interested to find out very similar process. They're very interested to find things that will help with their organization, with the work that they do. So for instance, say a company has a certain product or service that it wants to market to the broader community, the broader market. So what they do oftentimes, one common method that they use is the focus group approach. So they might call up people or to gather people, a number of potential clients or customers, gather them together and then show them the product and ask them, hey, what do you think about this product? What do you like? What do you dislike? What can be improved? Do you prefer to have more colors, or do you like to have it in more shapes or sizes? So on and so forth. So companies, businesses, they do this, they use proprietary research because they want to find, again, data to help them to inform the products or the services that they offer to the public, so that it makes their products more marketable, so that they can sell more units of that, essentially. So we have scholarly research, we have proprietary research. So the methods that we use to find data, to answer questions, can be found in these two major realms. And the methods that we learn and that we will be learning in this course, very useful in both areas, in scholarly and proprietary research. A little bit more about scholarly research. First of all, is formal and systematic. Reason because we use, as I mentioned 2 slides ago, we use very systematic scientific steps, very established steps that researchers in the field or the area of study have established use in many instances, so they all share the same steps. So when a researcher is doing a sort of research using the same paradigm, and as we say paradigm, I'll talk a little bit about qualitative and quantitative research paradigms, different ways of collecting and thinking about research. When we use different paradigms to do our scholarly research, the researchers who belong to either of those 2 paradigms, they would expect the other researchers to also follow certain patterns of approaching data collection and analysis, and how we go source to find and analyze those data to answer those questions. Scholarly research is also publicly available, so you can very easily go on to your favorite search engine or the university's library website, plug in keywords about something that you're curious about, and then you will get returns, the hits from the search engine or the library search that presents the the research that has been done. And so the reason why scholarly research is publicly available is because we want to share, make other researchers know, or make our research findings known to other researchers so that they can use it as research consumers. Scientific outcome. What are some attributes of scholarly research? We believe that there will be some of these scientific outcomes that we seek for. When we do scholarly social science research, one of the objectives is to describe behavior. We want to know why people, say, in certain conditions or certain environments, under certain influences or under certain settings, why do they behave in certain ways? Okay, so if we are able to describe why people behave or act in certain ways, then we can then predict. So let me jump to point number 3 first. We can then predict what their future behavior is going to be like. So for example, if we know that if there's a lot of free food that's available, you can go to a room, there's lots of free food, you don't have to pay anything, you just have to go and grab whatever food you want to eat, then we may be able to predict what might happen. Well, if there's free food, chances are people will show up most of the time. So scientific outcomes of social science research is that we want to understand how people behave, so we can describe the behavior, why they do certain things, and by understanding how they behave and how they do things, we then can apply our findings to predict how certain elements or the presence of some factors or influences may influence people further in how they're going to behave. We also would like to determine the causes of people's behavior, and again, when we understand what shapes the way they think or the perceptions resulting in how they act or behave, that helps us to create ways to solve problems. So for instance, public health researchers, they have always been interested in public health campaigns and how to promote the public's health. So for example, if we are interested in lowering the number of people who smoke because we believe that smoking is bad for people's health, then what are the factors or the influences that would make it easy for people to have access to cigarettes, and why do they smoke? If we understand why they smoke, why do they choose to smoke, then we can then figure out how can we help them to minimize or to eliminate smoking. So scholarly research is very interesting because it helps us to understand human behavior, helps us to understand it, to describe it, as well as to predict human behavior so that we can influence people's behaviors for the better good, for the good of society. What is the relationship between research and theory? Well, these two elements, theory and research, their relationship is very tight. They go hand in hand. So the purpose or the function of theory is that it helps us to frame our research, to help us understand. But before we talk about the relationship, let us have a recap of what theory means. Now, theory means that it is some kind of a set of concepts or definitions or propositions that help us to systematically view a phenomenon. All right. So the theory helps us to simplify some elements that researchers have studied, taken a long time to study, and they simplify to help to explain for us. So for example, a theory can be, say, every time there is thunder, you would see lightning. Okay, so that's a very simplified theory. When you hear thunder, you're going to see lightning. So the theory is created after many instances observing that. Now, if you think about it in your own lives, you probably might think that is pretty true. When it's about to rain, you start to hear thunder, and then you might also see lightning. Now, if you go to other parts of the world or the country, perhaps that theory might not hold. In those places, perhaps you have thunder, but there is no lightning, or maybe there will be lightning, but you won't hear thunder. Okay, so in those instances, the theory that the thunder will come before the lightning will not hold or will not apply in those contexts, and there might be some reasons to explain that. Okay, so again, theory helps us in a very simplified manner, helps us to understand phenomenon. If theory is developed or created over multiple tests over a long period of time to help us to understand and to explain and to predict things that we observe in our world, like the example I gave you. After multiple visits or multiple observations, we know that if we hear thunder, lightning is going to show up pretty soon, and so if you keep your eyes open, you probably can see it. So that's the role of theory, and theory evolves or are created because researchers conduct research. Okay, so therefore the relationship is very tight. There is theory oftentimes that informs how the researcher frames the research, how the researcher is going to look at the problem that he or she wants to study, and then conducts the study. So research is oftentimes theoretically driven or is based on some theory that the researcher is familiar with. All right, it's based on some theory that helps us to go forward. So think about lenses. Some of us might be short-sighted or nearsighted. Okay, so if you cannot see things that's too far away, you might want to wear glasses. So your glasses help you to see further. Yes, so your glasses is the lens to help you see, to have a better vision. So the same idea when researchers do research, the theories are like the glasses that they wear to help them focus, to help them see more clearly the question and the phenomenon that they want to do their study on. Communication as a social science. When we say social science, oftentimes we look at two paradigms. I kind of alluded at the start of the lecture. We have the quantitative paradigm using quantitative methods. So simplistically, quantitative research or methods oftentimes relies on numerical measurement. We're talking about numbers. So anything that has to do with numbers, the analysis and collection of numbers is oftentimes quantitative. On the other hand, qualitative research oftentimes is based on the researcher's observations, first-hand observations of phenomenon that he or she is interested to study. So the researcher is the primary observer, and the researcher is one of the research tools that are actively involved in the data collection and analysis. Okay, so coming back to what social science is, we are looking at patterns of people's communication behavior and their activities. We say that it's empirical. Reason because the phenomenon or the behaviors that we want to observe or to study are observable and they can be measured. Meaning to say, we can count, for instance, or we can put a number to it. Okay. So, for instance, if we say we are looking at people and say, how do we know people are happy? Maybe one way is to see how many times they smile. So if you observe people and we say, oh, how happy are people? Maybe over an average of say over 2 minutes, we can look at them and see how often they smile. Once, twice, thrice. So every time they smile, we take note of it, so we can measure it. Okay. So when we can put a number to it, we're measuring it, we're observing it. It's empirical because that is data. And when we say social science research is communication, or we are interested in the communication phenomenon, essentially we're focusing on messages and symbols and the meanings behind those messages and symbols. Therefore, we say communication research is a social science for these reasons, because it is empirical, because we are curious about the meanings, the meanings behind the messages or the symbols, and we do it from an empirical perspective using either the quantitative approach or the qualitative approach. Now, sometimes researchers might marry the two methods or approaches and do a quantitative and qualitative approach. The scientific approach, well, we say that communication research is scientific reason because we follow a certain set of procedures and traditions, as I've talked about earlier in the chapter. The way that we observe certain steps or procedures or protocols that other researchers who use the same method would observe. Okay, so the approach oftentimes is that from a scientific point of view, we start off by asking an interesting question, a question that we're curious about. It can be perhaps questions that researchers have been talking or curious to investigate. Perhaps can be some personally interesting question that you have a personal interest in because it's interesting to you, because you want to know the information, you want to know what is the outcome, or you want to understand why people behave in a certain way or say certain things. Okay, and based on the interesting question, we'll formulate our interesting research problem as a hypothesis, which we oftentimes use in quantitative research, or we might frame it as a research question, which we apply in qualitative research. So either the hypothesis or the research question helps to drive the investigation forward because that is the question that we're interested in study. We conduct our research using ways like observation, and then we try to measure what we observe or what we can find or what we can see or hear. After we've collected the data, we analyze and interpret the data, and so that we make sense of what we have studied, make sense of what we have collected, what we have observed, what we have seen or heard. So pretty much the approach, the scientific way to do social science research follows these steps. There's an interesting question we're interested in. How do we frame that question? How do we approach it? Is it a hypothesis or a research question? And then we conduct our first-hand empirical data collection in various ways. So some of these ways, and we'll spend the rest of this course looking at what hypotheses and research questions mean and what kind of tools and what kind of approaches that we take to gather the data that we need to find to understand and make sense of the research question that we have. But so first of all, very important to remember, this is an overview of the entire course. A lot of these new terms may or may not be new to you, but we'll be using this vocabulary, these new terms, to help us make sense and understand the language that communication and social scientists use in doing our work. All right, the characteristics of science. Now there are a number of points right here that we will use to talk about how we do social science research. What is the uniqueness of social science research? So we talk about it. Social science is empirical because we collect data. We believe truth is out there. We're going to find the data to help us understand, to answer the question that we have. So it's based on evidence or data that we will be collecting. Social science research is also testable, and what we mean by testable is that the proposition, the research questions, or the hypothesis that we presented, there are ways for us to find that information out in the world. If we cannot test the research question or the research study that we have, then we are not able to find the data, because if you can't test it, you cannot find data, and if you cannot get the data, then it is probably just speculation, or it is not in the social science paradigm. So we cannot do work that is not testable. Okay, so if we believe the truth is out there, the evidence is out there, we'll go seek it, and then the research question or hypothesis is testable. We have to explore all possibilities because we want to see if the propositions to inform our hypothesis and research questions are indeed testable, and as well as that they can be demonstrated to be testable, and that we can seek data to demonstrate them. Social science research can be replicable. Reason that we can repeat it. We can do it multiple times. So remember, we talk about scientific approach when we have certain fixed steps or standard procedures that we'll take. Now, if we share that procedure with everyone else now, and they should be able to replicate or repeat those procedures. And if the conditions are very similar, they're probably going to get very similar outcomes. Therefore, we say the work of social science, especially or science research, is replicable because we must be able to have the steps systematically recorded and shared so that it can be repeated. What's the point of having it repeatable? It's because we are putting our research out there as public record so that other researchers can read it, they can test it, as we talk about in point number 2. They can see if it's replicable or it can be repeated, and then if the findings concur or are very similar to the original findings, then that's good because it strengthens the original findings. But if the researchers, future researchers, using the same research steps and procedures find new data or new interpretation, then research can be self-correcting. This point right here, the last one on this column, is self-correcting because we might have found new ways of looking at things or new interpretation about the phenomena we are studying. Science is measurable and observable because truth is out there, is empirical, something that we can grasp. We can see it, we can hear it, sometimes maybe we can touch it. Okay? We recognize that there is error in science as well. Reason because when anytime we try to measure or observe things, there can be some form of error involved. Nothing is 100% all the time. There will be some form of error, some margin of give or take. So we have to recognize that when we conduct research, especially if it involves human, then there has to be some room of error. And in future chapters, we'll look at the level of error, the margin of error that researchers are comfortable with to work with. It is scientific. We try to minimize biases and distortion, meaning to say we try to do research as systematically as we can and as objective as we can. Now, it doesn't mean that all research is completely void of subjective interpretation, because anytime when we have to interpret data, there's some subjectivity involved. But the idea is that we want to avoid bias such that our intentions are clear, that is observable, the steps that we take to come to a conclusion in our research study. Researchers by nature are very skeptical about findings from other researchers because we want to see what steps have they taken, have they been rigorous in their approach, have they missed out on any factors, did they miss out on some possibilities in their conclusions. So we're skeptical in how people conduct their research and the conclusions that they make. In that way, we are verifying if the publicly accessible research is done accurately and done correctly. Research should be generalizable. Reason because we cannot do study on everyone, but we want to do on a small enough sample that we are able to spend our resources on, but at the same time not large enough that it makes our approach too bulky or slow down our work. So the idea is that when we do a study on some individuals, we can then generalize it or apply the findings to other contexts in similar population. Scientific work is also heuristic because it helps us to trigger new questions, new thoughts, some follow-up questions to follow up on that train of thought about what was our original curiosity. So these future questions, they help us to develop a more richer understanding and appreciation of the original question that we would have asked. In this research methods course, we'll be learning about a few different kinds of methods, both quantitative and qualitative. Key thing to understand is that there is no one method that is superior or the supreme method that is the best in all conditions. Okay, in different contexts, in different situations, settings as well as things that we're interested in to study. Different methods will have different strengths and weaknesses, and the best method for those instances will be the one that's most appropriate. So there is no one method that is the best, but sometimes in different situations, some methods are superior or better because they fit the situation. Okay, they fit the context of the work that we're interested to study. So research should be driven not by the method that we prefer or our pet method that we want to use, but rather is driven by the research question or hypothesis, as well as the need for finding the appropriate data to answer the question that we have. So it's more driven that way based on the question, the research question, and the context, the subject nature, rather driven than the method that we want to use. Okay, so the best method is only the one that is most useful in helping us answer the question that we have. All right. Okay. What kind of questions do comm scholars typically ask? The kind of research that interests or intrigue communication researchers. Sometimes it is something that is personally interesting. Out of personal interest, we do the study because we are curious, we want to find information on that topic, and so it's driven by that desire. Sometimes it's because it is important socially. It's important because society or the community that we live in, we are interested to find information on that question or topic, and so that drives our work. So it's important because other people are interested in it, or because other people also want to find information or insight to it. A third reason that we might use to ground our research is because it's theoretically significant. Okay, earlier we talked about the relationship between theory and research. So some research is driven by the theory. Maybe the theory is outdated because it has been around for decades, and because of new changes in our environment today, that causes the theory to be outdated and we need to update it. So some research is driven by the theory or the theories that undergird as the background of the study. So it can take one or all of these three possible drivers that help us develop our research questions and programs. Ultimately, all of these agendas or the motivations, they help us to explain the so what question. So, I conduct this study and we found these findings and it's very interesting, but so what? It has to serve some kind of purpose. It helps help us to connect back to the original question that we are curious to find out, and to answer the questions that we have interest to find insights and answers for. Alright, so the nature of questions that we ask as we follow up from the previous slide, it can be based on questions of fact. So we're trying to find definitions to help understand or define or to conceptualize concepts that we are interested in study. We want to give it more concrete definitions or more concrete parameters so that we are more clear, we have become clearer in what we want to study. It can be based on the variable relationships, so meaning to say how do different entities relate to one another, as things change, what is the relationship or how did they relate to one another. It can also be issues of value, meaning to say what we believe to be true, to be correct or wrong. Okay, so these are some subjective evaluations: the truth, the value, the validity, or the accuracy of things, the right or wrong. Okay, can be based on things like that. So why, for example, you can ask a research question: why do teenagers like to be on social media, for example? So we can then find out the reasons why teenagers like to be on social media, and there are some value. They can help us to unearth some value. Maybe social media helps them to feel connected with their friends, or maybe it's something that they grew up using, so it's something that's very natural to them, so on and so forth. So we learn about the values that drive those individuals that we're interested in study. Finally, questions that researchers conduct can also answer questions of policy. So the data or the findings that the researchers gather and the interpretation can help inform the change the way policies are implemented, how things are done, say, in organizations or in a country. So overall, we have looked at this outlined the purpose of doing research, some of the conditions that inform the way researchers think about social science research in qualitative and quantitative ways, the thoughts that researchers put into as we conduct or design our study, and then of course eventually conduct our study, then the undergirding foundations, so whether it's a personal interest, maybe a societal interest, or maybe it's driven by some theoretical foundation, and what kind of questions, what kind of purpose do they serve, the research that we do. So this chapter helps us to have that overview of what researchers do, and it gives us a very good foundation as we go into the future chapters of this course as well as this book.